Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear from another of the inquiry's expert witnesses. Yes, Mr. Rowett.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Our witness today is going to be Professor David Purser. But before I call Professor Purser, can I just explain what we're going to be doing today? He will begin his evidence by giving a presentation setting out what he has, or the work that's gone into his Phase 1 report, which has been circulated and published. The presentation is in 3 parts, and for each part, the professor has prepared detailed slides to which he will be speaking.
Yes.
If I make clear, these slides contain images including diagrams of flame ingress and smoke production, photographs of the tower, and also fire damage in other buildings. Because of the nature of the professor's work, he will also be talking about the impact of toxic gases on people.
So there's quite a lot that might be distressing.
That is exactly it.
Yes.
So what I want to do, I will give a shorter warning as we go through the presentation, but I want to repeat a warning now that we've given on previous occasions, that some may find the contents of the slide and indeed of the presentation itself distressing.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, if people fear that they may be upset by what's going to be shown, they can, of course, leave, and they can leave at any time if they feel that's appropriate.
Thank you. So can I now call Professor David Purser?
Yes, thank you.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, do you prefer to stand up to give your...
I'll start by standing up. I might perch on this stool.
Oh, when I get very nice, yes. Yes, do.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Rowett.
Good morning, Professor.
Morning.
Could you confirm your full name for the record, please?
I'm David Anthony Purser.
And can you confirm that you have provided a preliminary Phase 1 report to the inquiry, which is dated the 5th of November 2018?
I have.
And can you also confirm that you were asked in that Phase 1 report to address 3 matters? Firstly, the production of toxic gases in fires similar to that at Grenfell Tower, and the consequences of inhaling toxic gases in such circumstances, both physiological and behavioural. Secondly, the toxicity when exposed to fire of certain materials which were present at Grenfell Tower. And thirdly, any recommendations arising from those 2 points that I've just set out, including as to any further testing which ought to be carried out, which is relevant to the issues.
Yes.
Is it also right that you were asked to set out your preliminary conclusions on, again, 3 matters? Firstly, the production of toxic gases and consequences to occupants of different generic fire scenarios and conditions occurring in fires similar to those likely to have occurred at different stages and locations during the Grenfell Tower fire. Secondly, the likely causes of incapacitation and death at Grenfell Tower, including those whose bodies were consumed by the fire. And thirdly, the possible toxicity performance of materials present at Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
It is important to note before we continue that you have also been instructed to provide a further report at Phase 2, which will address the matters that I've just listed, but which will be updated and expanded as necessary.
Yes.
You have confirmed and said in your report that it is a preliminary report and you intend to conduct a more detailed analysis in your Phase 2 report. That's right,
Yes, that's an important point.
So is it right, therefore, that the views that you express in your Phase 1 report are provisional?
Yes.
But can you confirm that the statements made in that report, whilst provisional, are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
And can you also confirm that you've provided this that you've provided this report in the same way as you would have provided a report to a court?
Yes.
Can I begin then just by dealing with your professional background? Appendix C to your report sets out your background and experience relevant to matters in this inquiry. I'm not going to rehearse all of that today, but I just want to pick out some key points. The first of those is that you have a PhD in neurophysiology from the University of Birmingham, and you're also a diplomate member of the Royal College of Pathologists. Is that right? And then, secondly, for 17 years, from 1974 to 1991, you were in the Department of Inhalation Toxicology at the Huntingdon Research Centre, where you conducted and directed research in environmental and inhalation toxicology.
Correct.
And that work included research into the effects of fire products on the nervous system, lung function, and behaviour in order to evaluate the mechanisms whereby fire products cause incapacitation and death.
Yes.
In 1991, you joined the Building Research Establishment, and up to 2006, you then continued to conduct and direct research on the toxicological and behavioural aspects of human fire exposures. Is that right?
Yes, and that included a lot of work on fire chemistry and fire testing and things like that.
To develop that a little, your research included the psychology of human behaviour in fires.
Yes.
The chemical yields of toxic products in fires.
Yes.
And the evaluation of fire hazard development.
Yes.
You have also lectured on toxicology, combustion chemistry and fire safety at a number of universities, both national and international.
Yes.
You've authored and presented a total of 152 publications and conference presentations, is that right?
Yes.
And you've been a member of a number of British and international safety committees relating to fire hazards, fire toxicity, fire safety engineering and means of escape.
I have, yes.
You've also been a member of health expert committees established to give advice to the Chief Medical Officer.
Yes.
As a consultant, you've advised on national and international standards and on toxic and environmental standards, particularly involving combustion.
Yeah.
And you've also advised on means of escape design in a number of building projects, both in the UK and abroad.
Yeah.
As a legal expert, you've been instructed in cases both in this country and internationally as an expert in fire toxicity and human behaviour in fire.
Yes.
And that included the Rose Park fire, which you will be discussing today. Is it right that in 2013, the Institution of Fire Engineers awarded you the David Rashbash Medal for outstanding contribution to the advancement of knowledge in fire behaviour?
Yes, they did.
And finally, is it right also that in 2015, you were made a commander of the British Empire for services to fire safety?
Yes.
I've explained before you came in, Professor, that the first part of today's hearing is going to involve a presentation from you on your report. It's in three parts, the first part of which is headed Production of Toxic Smoke and Gases and Effects in Generic Domestic Fire Scenarios similar to those occurring at Grenfell. Can I now invite you to give the first part of that presentation?
Thank you very much. Okay, well then, just to reprise some of that, I just wanted to highlight the fact that initially I'm going to be talking about generic effects, and you might be wondering why I'm going to address generic effects rather than just talking specifically about Grenfell, and I will come to that later. And also to reprise the point that my phase 1 report is intended to be a general report that does not make reference to specific detailed evidence regarding individual Grenfell occupants. But for phase 2, the report will be updated and expanded as necessary in relation to the continuing evidence. And I will be then bringing in a lot more detail about the witness statements and oral evidence and the transcripts of emergency calls made by Grenfell occupants during the fire. And I will also be reviewing the firefighter evidence. Now, I've already been doing a lot of work on this area, and so while I'm talking to you today, although I'm not going to go into great detail about individual persons, a lot of this material is in the back of my mind as I speak to you and as informing my presentations. My main objective, main purpose as I see it, is to obtain a detailed understanding of the conditions to which each person inside the tower is exposed and how their behaviour, escape capabilities and survival were affected. Now, before I go a bit further into my report, I just wanted to highlight a few small points. And the first one is, what do we mean in this context by toxicity or toxicology? And I think you might find it useful to think of toxicology as having two main aspects. One aspect is pathology, which is basically tissue damage, and the other is physiology, which is the direct, immediate effects on people. Now, pathological toxicological effects often take place over a long period of time. Minimally, they usually take days to develop, and frequently months to years. But physiological effects, which are also part of toxicology, can happen in seconds to minutes. And it's these physiological effects of exposure to combustion products which is so important in determining whether people survive or die during a fire. And it's really on these physiological effects that I'm going to be concentrating my work today. And you'll be hearing a lot about this. These sort of compounds in smoke that have physiological effects are mainly the irritants, chemicals, and the smoke particles themselves, and certain gases. And that brings me on to my second point, but what do we mean by smoke? Well, smoke, strictly speaking, is the stuff that you can see during a fire, the grey and black smoke. And that is composed of very, very fine, respirable carbon particles. That's the essential part of smoke. The tiny particles of soot, essentially. Now, in its purest form, this material is relatively harmless, apart from the fact that you can't see through it. But in reality, during a fire, the fire produces lots of other chemicals, toxic chemicals. And the main problem with these chemicals is that they're highly irritant. Some of them are organic materials, and some of them are acid gases. And these compounds stick to the soot particles, so that when the smoke gets in your eyes or you inhale it, these can cause an immediate painful effect, making it difficult to see and difficult to breathe. So this is an immediate physiological effect of smoke. The smoke also contains permanent gases. And some of these permanent gases are asphyxiants, and you're going to hear me talking a lot today about asphyxiants. What these gases do is that when you inhale them, and you inhale a certain dose of these gases, they reduce the amount of oxygen getting to your heart and your brain, essentially, particularly the brain. And the brain hypoxia that's caused for this results in dizziness, confusion, and collapse, and ultimately death in fires. So the effects of these asphyxiant gases are extremely important. Now, when I talk about smoke in the next few slides, I'm really encompassing all these things because they all move together together in the fire. So when I'm talking about smoke, I'm thinking about the smoke particles, I'm thinking about the irritant compounds attached to those particles, and I'm also thinking about the irritant gases and the asphyxiant gases that are contained in that smoke. Okay, so that's smoke. Now, in order to understand what these are going to do to people, and how people at Grenfell were affected, and how it affected their ability to survive and escape, you'll understand that I've got to take into account a lot of different aspects of the way the fire developed and people were exposed at Grenfell. For example, one thing I need to know is when various different materials burned at different stages of the Grenfell fire, what toxic products did they produce and how much? We're talking there about the yield of toxic products. If I burn a kilogram of this lectern here, how many kilograms of the toxic gas carbon monoxide will be released into the atmosphere, for example. And so I need to know that. And that is the main subject of the third presentation I'm hoping to give you today, planning to give you today. But another thing that's obviously very important is not just what is formed, but when it's formed and where it goes. And so I really need to know how this smoke, once formed, either inside or outside the tower, has moved in and around the flats and the various spaces in the tower with time. And I'm particularly concerned about when the smoke got into the lobbies at Grenfell on the different floors, because this, I feel, was a key stage in the incident. And so in order to do that, I need a lot of very complicated information. And I'm relying mainly for that on the work of the other experts that you've heard from, who have described and shown you images of the fire going up the outside of the tower and shown you the damage inside the tower and these other aspects. So I need to make use of that. But particularly, I'm making use of what was observed by the occupants, by the witnesses that you've been hearing during the course of the fire, to help me build up a picture, if you like, of what the conditions were and how they were developing with time. And beyond that, I also need to understand, as we were hearing earlier, about how individual people will interact with this smoke once they're confronted by it. And that in itself is another quite complex area, because it's partly a physical or physiological thing, but very much it's a behavioural thing. If one person sees smoke in the exit over here, they may decide it's too dangerous to go through that smoke and they may stay here. Where another person may decide they can escape and they will plough on through the smoke. And so this brings me to my fourth point here, which is that a lot of the evidence you're going to hear from me today is really essentially qualitative, in that unlike the evidence from the other witnesses, where they can show you the actual picture of some part of the burnt tower or something like that, a lot of what I'm talking about is going on hidden inside the tower at different times. We don't know exactly when certain things were developed. We don't know exactly the conditions and the timing under which all the materials burned. And we certainly can't predict how each individual person would have reacted to what they were exposed to. But by taking into account a lot of the work that I've done in previous years in the laboratory and also in fire investigation and human behaviour, taken into the context of what we do know about Grenfell and what the witnesses have told us, I hope by the end of the day you will agree with me that I'm starting to get quite a good picture, if you like, of essentially what happened to people at Grenfell. So I hope that clarifies some of these points. So why is my Phase 1 report based mainly on generic evidence on fire hazards rather than specifically on Grenfell evidence? Well, it's because we do have a lot more detailed information from previous instances and investigations. And unfortunately, there are certain limitations, as I've alluded to, on the sort of evidence that we have from Grenfell, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a minute. And thirdly, and very importantly, as we heard, a lot of my work is preliminary, it's quite complex, a lot of the information is just coming in or hasn't yet come in, and so because some of these detailed aspects are still under investigation, it's better not to go into too much detail at the moment about individual occupants. So as you heard, my presentation is in 3 parts, and we're going to start with the first one, which is very general, about past work and not alludes to, sorts of scenarios that may have occurred at Grenfell. Part 2 is more specifically dealing with what happened at Grenfell. And part 3 is about the performance of the materials. Now, one thing that I always have at the back of my mind in these cases, and I'd like you to do the same, is that what happens in fire is very, very time dependent. And this is reflected in the performance-based design principle, which underlines a lot of the fire safety engineering standards. In fact, I'm currently working on the British standard at the moment, which is being revised. I'm leading a panel on this. And so fire hazards depend essentially on 2 parallel processes. There's 2 things going on simultaneously in fires. And one of these is the time from ignition, when the fire starts, to when that fire becomes dangerous. So the fire starts very small, and it gets bigger and bigger, and it spreads throughout a building, and this is happening over a period of time. The threat is increasing. In parallel with that, you've got the behaviour of the occupants. When will they first realise or be warned that there's a fire? When will they decide to evacuate? How long will it take them to evacuate? And how does that parallel with the threat, the hazard that's facing them? Essentially, in a design context, what we want to ensure is that the available safe escape time, the time available for escape, is greater than the time people need to escape by an appropriate safety margin. And I've kind of illustrated that in principle down in the bottom corner here. So normally the work I do, I'm concerned with actually trying to get people to evacuate very quickly in a fire situation. And so one's very interested in the time from detection to the fire alarm and the time from the fire alarm to when people start to move. And generally speaking, if people start to be alerted and warned early on and they start to move early on, there's usually a sort of golden early period during any fire when people can make a safe escape. But the problem with fires, as illustrated by this curve here, is that they tend to, the rate at which they get worse tends to get exponentially greater. So that if you delay, then you get caught by this time period when the conditions can very, very rapidly deteriorate. And a stark example of that was the Bradford Stadium fire, which I had some involvement with the investigation of, in 1985. And here, this was all captured on television. The match was being televised, and you can probably find the video on the web if you want to look for it. But the point here was that at the early stages here, the fire was burning underneath the stand, and you see people here standing around not too concerned initially, but very rapidly then the fire went to flashover, and sadly people were running onto the pitch, and the heat from the fire was igniting their hair. So conditions can deteriorate very rapidly once things start to develop. Now, in order to try to understand the hazards in a specific fire and when it becomes dangerous, ideally what I need is to determine the time concentration curves for the fire hazards occupants were exposed to, because I'm trying to work out how long this time available is for escape. And the three hazards that I'm mainly concerned about are the smoke, the visibility and density of the smoke, and because of the way that affects people's ability and behaviour to escape. I'm interested, secondly, in the asphyxiant gases, because when people have inhaled a certain dose, as I say, they call likely to collapse. And of course, I'm also interested in whether they will be exposed to heat and suffer burns during the fire, which in itself may incapacitate or kill them. And what I'm trying to do is determine the time during the fire at which escape capability was affected by each hazard, because they tend to occur in a sequence, and when collapse and death occurred or is predicted, to find out the effects on occupants' escape behaviour and survival. Now, on the right-hand side here, I have a set of curves from a reconstruction test of the Rose Park care home fire. And I'm going to show you more of these in the next few slides. But the only point I'm trying to make at the moment is, because we did a reconstruction of this fire, we have the actual time concentration curves measured for the heat, the smoke, and each of the toxic gases in the fire. And you'll notice here that at the beginning of this particular fire, there's a period of about 4 or 5 minutes when there's hardly any smoke or gases in the experimental rig. And during that time, if a person was standing under those conditions in that room, they would have 4 or 5 minutes of easy time for escape. But after that, the fire suddenly becomes very serious and they would be in a lot of trouble. And that's why in any fire hazard assessment situation, I'm interested in how these different hazards develop with time during the fire. Now, in order to do a detailed analysis of the hazards in a fire, ideally, when one's investigating an incident, there are a number of things that one needs to have. The first thing is a detailed fire incident investigation. And this is in order to obtain in-depth information on the interactions between what's happening to the building, how the fire is developing, and the effects on the occupants. And this would involve the sort of things that have been done for Grenfell, examining the remains in the building, interviews with survivors, and finding their detailed experiences. All that kind of basic fire investigation work you've been hearing about from the other experts. It would also involve toxicology and pathology studies. And this applies both to people who have died in the fire, may have died in the fire, also to people who have survived the fire but had to go to hospital because they've been injured. And so in these studies, what we want to know is to what extent were people burned? That's pretty obvious. How much smoke did they inhale? And you can look at the soot in the airways and things like this, both of living and dead people. And particularly, there's one very important and powerful tool that we have, and I'm going to be talking about quite a lot today, and that on this slide is labelled COHB. COHB stands for carboxyhemoglobin. Basically, what happens in a fire is that there's always a certain amount of a toxic gas called carbon monoxide. And as a person inhales carbon monoxide, the carbon monoxide combines with the hemoglobin in their blood to form carboxyhemoglobin. And the longer the person is exposed to that carbon monoxide, and the higher the concentration of the carbon monoxide inhaled, the greater the level of carboxyhemoglobin reached in the blood. And so this is a very important tool in assessing the extent and degree to which people have been exposed to toxic smoke, because not only the CO, but all the other toxic gases in the fire are all together. So the COHB is a very good measure of this. And it's routinely measured in both fire victims and survivors. And so by looking at the carboxyhemoglobin in the blood of decedents or fatalities or survivors, it tells us a lot about what they experienced in the fire. Now, these fire investigations can give us a lot of useful information, but one thing they lack, and this is particularly true for Grenfell, is there's no detailed information on the conditions during the fire, from an investigation after the event, and no detailed information on the effects of the individual hazards. Unfortunately, we don't have any devices in Grenfell which measure carbon monoxide as the fire goes on. We do have, however, the fatalities, which in a way gives us a kind of measure. Okay, so that's the first part. But then the next thing that we would like to do if we're doing an in-depth investigation is to set up a full-scale fire reconstruction test to duplicate what happened during the actual incident as far as we are able to do so. If we do such a test, then we can, as at Bradford Rose Park, as it shows on the right there, then we can measure those gases, the temperature and the heat with time, and have a complete record of that. But even this is not perfect, because the test conditions in an experimental duplication or replication fire are not always identical, no matter how careful you are, to those that occurred during the actual incident. And of course, it doesn't tell us anything about the actual effects on the occupants. All we're measuring is gases and smoke. And I would like to take this point to emphasize, because it's important later on, that even if you set up a large-scale fire test and repeat it several times with the identical setup of all the fuels and the way you ignite it, fires can be inherently variable. And so that fire test can develop in several different ways in different circumstances, even though you've done your ultimate best to try and duplicate the individual. So having a combination of instant investigation showing the damage and a test does provide useful information, but it's not the end everything. The third thing that we can do, or I can do, is to look at the human physiological data on exposures to individual fire gases and mixtures. And so what I do is I use some physiological calculation methods, most of which I've developed personally, to, they're called FED models, and I'm going to explain a bit more about that in a minute. But their main purpose is to predict the timing and effects of what would happen to somebody if they were exposed to the smoke, irritants, and asphyxiant gases or heat in the conditions during the experimental test fire. So we don't have people there, but I'm saying if we did have a person in there, I can calculate what would happen to them. Now, like any model or any method, there are certain variations and uncertainties about this, but it gives us a good way of predicting what would happen. We do need to validate it against real human exposures in actual fire incidents. Now, where these methods become quite powerful is when we combine all three. And just to give you an example of this, supposing I carry out a reconstruction test, such as at Rose Park, and I measure the carbon monoxide during the test. Well, I'm able to calculate as part of my analysis, the amount of carbon monoxide taken up by a person who might have been standing in that rig, and calculate their carboxyhemoglobin, say at the time they were rescued. So let's say they may have rescued, they may have 40% carboxyhemoglobin in their blood. What I can then do is look at the blood samples taken from the actual victims in the real incident and see if they have similar levels of carboxyhemoglobin in their blood to those I predict from the reconstruction test. And if we find that the two measures are in reasonable agreement, this provides validation that the conditions in the fire reconstruction test were a good recreation of the conditions in the actual incident. And it also gives us a lot of information on how and when the occupants were exposed and overcome in the fire. So the purpose then is to understand how flames and smoke developed and spread through a building, how and when occupants were exposed to heat and toxic smoke, why they were unable to escape, and how they died. Now, trying to apply that to Grenfell, one way of looking at it is that Grenfell can be considered as approximately 100 separate domestic fires, fires in what we call domestic dwellings, i.e. fires in flats. And looking at the totality, there are four main kind of what I'm going to call occupant exposure scenarios. So the first one, for example, would be where occupants are alerted early during the fire, and then they evacuate or perhaps decide to remain. But the point is that because they've decided to move or take action early, they experience no or minimal exposure to toxic smoke or heat. They may have some exposure, which may influence their behaviour, but physiologically they're going to be minimally affected. That's one scenario, and that applies to, in fact, a lot of people who were in the Grenfell Tower. Secondly, they may be in a smoke-free flat for a while, but then open the door to the lobby and find the lobby filled with a very dense smoke. A very difficult situation because of the decision they're then faced with. And so then, depending on the conditions in that smoke and the irritants and gases in that smoke, they may then decide to remain, shut the door and remain in the flat, which has certain consequences, or they may attempt to move through the smoke, which may or may not have other consequences regarding whether they succeed in escaping. Or they may be in their flats for an hour or more while smoke slowly builds up in the flat, perhaps leaking under the flat entrance door from the lobby. And so they have a long, slow, gradually increasing exposure to these toxic smoke and gases, rather than a sudden cliff edge, high concentration one. And then you may have another situation where at some point fire appears outside the flat and breaks in, and you've got a rapidly growing flaming fire in your flat. You then have to deal with the consequences of this rapid short-term evacuation. So those are the kinds of basic exposure scenarios, if you like, that I'm considering here. The other thing, of course, is that there are a number of different fire development scenarios in different flats and other locations. This refers to the way that the fire actually developed, which I'm going to talk about a bit. So I want to talk about Rose Park for two reasons. One is as an example, if you like, of a fairly ideal fire investigation with a lot of information, so to show how these techniques can be applied. But secondly, because I believe quite a lot of the exposure scenarios occurring at Rose Park are relevant to the sorts of general exposure scenarios faced by by most of the Grenfell occupants. So this fire occurred in January 2004 and resulted in 14 deaths of the elderly residents of this care home. And on behalf of the Scottish Office and the Procreative Fiscal, the legal authority in Scotland, the building research establishment, my colleagues and I were asked to carry out a full-scale reconstruction of the actual incident. My part in this was to advise on the setup of the rig and to assist with the measurement and interpretation of the gases and the FED calculations. Not only that, but in fact, we were then asked to carry out another full-scale reconstruction, but this time with sprinklers. What would have happened if there had been sprinklers in that care home, which we did, and in fact that has resulted in some changes in the legislation in Scotland regarding the requirements for sprinklers. And then thirdly, we did another reconstruction where we replaced the ordinary doors on each of the residents' rooms, which were involved in the fire, with half-hour fire doors, to see what influence that would have had on the way the hazards might have developed. And of course that's quite relevant to some of the issues at Grenfell. Then finally, after that, this is about the time I retired from BRE, I was asked by the Procreative Fiscal to investigate the timeline and effects on the decedents, on the fatalities and the survivors, to understand the hazards they were exposed to and how they were affected. Now this is a picture of some photographs of the rig that we built to replicate the Rose Park fire. You don't need to understand the details of this, except to realise that basically what we had here was a sort of dogleg, 2 corridors, and off these corridors were the individual rooms where the occupants were spending the night. But the point I want to make to you is that in this rig, we have tried as far as we can to exactly replicate the original building, not just the building itself and the bedrooms, but all the original materials. So with the aid of the Glasgow police, we were able to source the actual materials identical to those that were there on the night of the fire. For example, and that included, with some difficulty, getting hold of these sort of reclining chair objects, which were heavily padded and may have well have been were a major source of cyanide during the course of this fire. Now the second set of photographs here shows you the rig after the test, and you can see there's quite a bit of fire damage there. The fire was actually in a cupboard on the left here, started in a cupboard. But another point I want to make to you is that although there's quite a bit of damage here, this fire was a very short, violent fire. It itself extinguished in a few minutes because it was in an enclosed space. So most of the building and the contents and everything else, although damaged, was still there for us to investigate. And this contrasts to some extent with a lot of the material at Grenfell, because Grenfell continued for about 24 hours. A lot of the material that was involved in the crucial earlier periods of the fire has been destroyed, whereas at Rose Park, most of it was still there. So I'm just going to talk you through a little bit about the Rose Park incident. So, as I say, it started as a short, violent fire in a cupboard, which is shown on the bottom slide here. And again, we tried as far as we could to replicate what was in that cupboard. And this little graph here shows the temperature in the cupboard as the fire developed. And you can see that it was very short-lived, but it went up to about 1,000 degrees centigrade at its peak. Very, very violent, short, hot fire. And the other thing that's important in this case, if we look at this diagram on the right, this is a plan of the building. And the bit that we've replicated in our rig, where the fire was, is this dogleg corridor here, and all the rooms off it. And there are 2 corridors, essentially. There's a corridor 4 set, and there's a corridor 3. And between the 2 is a set of fire doors. And these fire doors closed automatically when the fire started, triggered by a detection system. And this meant that these corridors and the rooms off it were, to some extent, protected from the smoke during the fire. But a particular feature of this incident was that this cupboard contained a lot of aerosol cans. And these aerosol cans exploded at intervals during the fire. Each time one of these cans exploded, it caused a pressure, an overpressure in this enclosed system, and blew this door open, allowing smoke to flow into corridor 3 and the rooms off corridor 3. And so what we've ended up with is a whole range of different exposure scenarios, because the people who are shown in black here, who are in open bedrooms off the fire corridor, with the doors open at night, were exposed to the full force of all the smoke and gases produced by this short fire. But the 2 people in these rooms here had their doors closed. And so instead of having a short, violent exposure, they had a long, slow exposure as the products gradually built up in their rooms, a bit like happened in some of the Grenfell flats when smoke was leaking in from the lobbies. And then we have the set of people off corridor 3 who had a somewhat lesser exposure still. So we've got a sort of different sets that we can look at there. And what I was able to do, of course, with this data, as I say, is we measured the gases, and then I analysed the effect. And the next slide is sort of blown up, simple diagram of this thing. So basically, as a result of this fire, we had very high concentrations of asphyxiant gases in the fire corridor. 13,000 ppm of carbon monoxide and about 800 ppm of cyanide. And it was very hot in the corridor. So anybody standing in the corridor would have been during that period would have collapsed and died within a few minutes and possibly suffered some burns. But there was nobody in the corridor. But then we have the people who are in the rooms off the corridor who essentially got the same gas exposure, but crucially not the same heat exposure. And this is something I want to develop in regard to Grenfell. I'll talk a bit more in a minute about that. And then we have the people off corridor 3, and, basically there are various levels of exposure. So these two people here in closed rooms had a slow build-up over a period of about an hour before they could be rescued by the fire service. These two people here, where the red is shown, had their doors open, but they had some protection from the fire doors. So their exposure was somewhat similar to the two blue ones, if you like. So those 4 people were alive, survived for nearly an hour in the fire, about half an hour before these two were rescued. And they were rescued alive. 2 of them were comatose and never recovered consciousness. In other words, they had hypoxic brain damage from the carbon monoxide and cyanide they'd inhaled. And 2 of them recovered consciousness and were actually relatively well for a short period. One lady was semi-conscious and she recovered in the ambulance and was talking to the ambulance service on the way to hospital. When they got to hospital, blood samples were taken and they were treated. But sadly, all 4 of them later died. And they died after sort of 36 to 48 hours from bronchopneumonia. So that to some extent, this may have been brought on by the irritant smoke they'd inhaled. On the other hand, elderly people going to bed rest in hospital are very prone to developing bronchopneumonia, particularly if they've had a smoke exposure. So they had a lesser exposure than the ones in the open bedrooms, who I predict died within a few minutes. And then the 3 pink people here had a lower exposure still. One person was just unconscious but recovered quickly. The other 2 were conscious when they were rescued, and they all survived the fire and made a good recovery. And finally, the lady in this room here had her door shut throughout. She had 2 layers of protection, and she was unaffected. And in fact, she was sort of joking with the fire officers as they helped her out of her room. So you can see a sort of spectrum of different types of exposure and of different effects, all of which I think are relevant to Grenfell. Because somebody who is in a flat in Grenfell when the fire breaks in from the outside through the windows, if they're standing in the same room as the fire has broken in, could be exposed to these rapidly deteriorating conditions with a sudden high peak of both heat and toxic gases, similar to the sort of conditions faced somebody standing in that corridor if they had been there. If, however, somebody in a Grenfell flat were to retire to another room and take refuge in another room within their flat after the fire's broken in, so suppose, for example, the fire's broken in through the lounge window, they may want to go and take refuge in a bedroom, and this did happen at Grenfell. But let's say, in this case, they left the interior doors in their flat open throughout. Then they're going to be in a similar exposure scenario to the people in the open bedrooms of this Rose Park incident. Whereas those who are in the closed rooms are relevant to people who, also in a Grenfell flat, who may have shut the internal doors to take refuge. Maybe some people took refuge, for example, in a bathroom or in the hallway, while there may be a fire the other side of their interior door burning in another room within the flat. Now, in order to assess these effects, just a little bit of technical stuff here. Each toxic gas in a fire at any time, we use the concept of fractional effective concentration, FEC, and fractional effective dose, FED. FEC is used for those hazards for which the immediate concentration is important, which is the smoke density, whether you can see through the smoke, and the irritant gases in the smoke, because these affect you immediately. If they're there, it affects you. If the smoke clears, you're all right. It's an immediate concentration-related effect. FED is for those hazards for which a certain dose level has to be acquired over a period of time before a certain effect occurs. There's more technical explanation of all this in my report, but in order to follow the slides I'm going to show you, the only thing you need to know is that on any of the charts I show you, when the line for any hazard, the FEC or FED line for any hazard, crosses 1 on the left-hand axis of a graph, the y-axis of a graph, then that is predicting the time during that fire when a certain hazard endpoint is reached, where the hazard has reached a level where it would have some significant impairment of the ability of a person to escape, or possibly whether they would collapse or even whether they would die at that point. So here's an example, which is from the Rose Park fire, and this shows over a short time scale here of 10 minutes, the concentrations of smoke and toxic gases, asphyxiant gases, in the open bedroom off that fire corridor at bed height, because all the elderly people in the rooms were asleep at the time of the fire in bed. And the lower picture is my fractional effective analysis of the effects that the exposure would have on a person who was in that room on that bed. And so what you can see here is that the green line is the smoke. So there's a lot of smoke flowing in. The red line is the carbon dioxide, which is always produced in fires. And the black line is the carbon monoxide, which, as I told you earlier, went to very high concentrations very quickly. Also, crucially, although it looks like a small blip here, there's, in toxicity terms, there's a high concentration of hydrogen cyanide, another asphyxiant gas. Then the lower image shows my calculated predictions of what exposure to that environment would do to a person exposed. And what this shows is that around about 4 minutes, this is the smoke line, it's going to get very densely smoke in there, and this is crossing the line of 1. So at about 4 minutes, a person in that room, had they been able to get up and leave, would have had some difficulty in moving through the smoke. Now, in the actual incident, all these elderly people were more or less confined to bed, so none of them tried to move out. But crucially, after 6 minutes, I'm predicting that a person exposed to this cocktail of asphyxiant gases would become unconscious. And I'm also calculating the uptake of carbon monoxide, and that's predicted to reach a lethal level, 50%, at 7.9 minutes. Another thing I've done in my calculation is to take the cyanide away and calculate how long it would be before somebody became incapacitated if there was no cyanide in this fire. And what the analysis shows is that if you didn't have the cyanide, you'd have about an extra minute available to make your escape. Now, a minute might not sound very much, but in a minute you can move 60 meters and possibly escape from a building. And this is why I feel that in fires like this, particularly fires involving upholstered furniture and things like domestic fires, cyanide can be an important factor in limiting the time available for people to escape. It's a cause of incapacitation. Not so much a cause of death, but a cause of why people who try to escape may collapse. But the other term I've got in here is the effects of heat, because we measure the temperature in the bedroom. I told you it was very hot in the corridor. But what's crucially important here, and this is very, very important and relevant to Grenfell, is that this is the FED curve for heat for somebody in that open bedroom. And you see that this curve is rising quite slowly, and it never gets to 1 on this axis, which means that during this fire, it's predicted that a person in that bed, although they would receive rapidly lethal exposure to asphyxiant gases, they would never suffer from pain. This is for pain from heat, this analysis. They would never suffer pain from heat, and they would certainly not suffer from burns. And that was corroborated by the pathology on these victims, because the bodies weren't burned. And they all had very high carboxyhemoglobins, as the test was predicting. Now this slide shows the pathology data, the toxicology data from the actual victims. And what I want to draw your attention to is the red numbers here, which are the carboxyhemoglobins in the blood of all the fatalities who were in the open bedrooms that I've said died after about 7 minutes during the fire. And you can see that they're all very high. Now, you may remember I told you that 50% carboxyhemoglobin is a lethal dose. Most people will collapse and become unconscious at about 30% carboxyhemoglobin. 50% is a lethal dose. So if 50% is lethal, how come, when most of these people are above 50, but we can see levels of 80, higher levels here? The reason for that is that once you become comatose and unconscious due to exposure to carbon monoxide, you're not dead. You may have collapsed, but you're still inhaling the carbon monoxide, you're still quietly breathing. And so, as long as you remain alive, you continue to inhale the asphyxiant gases, and your carboxyhemoglobin continues to increase in your blood until the point where your heart stops beating and you stop breathing. At that point, the carboxyhemoglobin becomes effectively frozen in the blood of that person and is very stable, so it's a very powerful tool. When the autopsy is done, maybe weeks later, those levels of carbon monoxide in the blood will be essentially the same. So they'll tell us the dose received during the fire. Now, the pink numbers here are for those 4 people who were rescued alive but in a serious condition. And you'll notice 2 things. One is that they're somewhat lower than for the fatalities. These were acquired over a long exposure period of up to an hour. And they're given 2 numbers there for each one. The reason for that is that for these, the blood samples are measured in the survivors when they get to hospital. And on the way to hospital, they're given oxygen, which, and this happened at Grenfell to some people, which washes the carbon monoxide out of the blood. And people can often make a good recovery when that happens. But I can compensate for that. I can back calculate from the measurement in hospital to what the dose would have been at the time of rescue. But in order to do that, I need to know precisely when the blood sample was taken after arrival at hospital. And what happened in this case was that although I had all the hospital records, I mean, I had tremendous access to all the hospital records, all the GP records of these people, in some of these cases, the time the blood sample was taken, exact time, wasn't recorded. But I know approximately when it was recorded because of the procedures that were going on and the order in which these are carried out in hospital. So I've had to give a range because of that uncertainty. And I suspect in reality these people were somewhere in the middle of that range. So these are the people who have not quite had a lethal dose. They survived for a while but then died in hospital. And then the blue lines there are for the people who, as I said, were either unconscious or awake, and you can see they're lower still. And so you've got this range of effects. So where this takes us is that for Rose Park, we have a detailed fire investigation, we have an examination of the fire scene, we have detailed interviews with survivors and other witnesses. So we do have some of that for Grenfell. But what we don't have for Grenfell is a full-scale reconstruction fire test of the parts of the building affected by the fire, including the same materials and contents as in the actual incident. We had replication at Rose Park of the original fire with measurement of the time concentration curves. We had calculation of the incapacitating effects, the FED calculations. We had all the data for carboxyhemoglobin, both from the test and from the actual fatalities. And so by comparing the two, we're able to make a good analysis of the situation. So when I compare that to what we have for Grenfell, we have some quite important differences. Because for Grenfell, we have a very large and complex fire with differing development in individual flats. So a full-scale reconstruction would just not be feasible. And the fire burned for a very long period, as I mentioned, so the building and its contents were very different after the fire than they were during the early stages, when most of the occupants were exposed to heat, possibly, and particularly to toxic smoke. And the combustible contents of many flats were completely burned out, so we can't say exactly when they burned or what was there at the time. Similarly, for the fatalities, many of the bodies of people whose remains were recovered from the flats were almost completely consumed during this extended fire. So it's difficult to establish the conditions they were exposed to during the fire before they died. Also, the pattern of fire development and smoke spread into and through the tower was very complex, involving penetration into the flats of a proportion of combustion products from the exterior cladding and insulation materials, from the structural materials around the windows, and then successive involvement of fires in the contents of different flats. Now, so it is possible, however, so what can we do for Grenfell? Well, it is possible, as I've explained, to identify a set of different exposure scenarios for Grenfell occupants, similar to those common in domestic fire incidents, fires in houses and flats, which happen in their hundreds every year, and I've investigated many. And for some of these, we do have a lot of detailed information, which I think we can, if you like, translate into the Grenfell situation with regard to the developing conditions. And Rose Park is one example of such an investigation. And from the information we do have on the development of the Grenfell fire and its data, from previous incidents and experimental fires, I believe it is possible to estimate the likely effects on Grenfell occupants. Also, from information on the fire performance, smoke, and toxic gas yields of generic versions of the exterior and interior structural materials at Grenfell, and of typical house and flat contents, such as furnishings and appliances, the possible contributions to the development and spread of toxic smoke into and through the tower with time can be estimated, but only very approximately. So I've used these above sources to estimate the likely general effects on Grenfell occupants. But we do have some very valuable data from the actual Grenfell incident. And in order to validate these estimates of these generic effects for individual Grenfell occupants, I'm making a detailed examination of the witness statements and the oral evidence, and also very valuable are the transcripts of the emergency calls from the occupants during the incident. And I have been asked questions about whether I've actually listened to these calls. And mainly because of time pressure so far, I haven't done that, but I certainly plan to do so as part of my phase 2 work. Now, I would like to really emphasize here that I'm finding these witness accounts and transcripts extremely valuable and effective in understanding the experiences of occupants during the fire and the effects of exposure to toxic smoke, both for those who survived and for many of those who subsequently died during the fire. So I would like to say to you that all of those of you who have gone through this traumatic experience and then given these detailed witness statements to the police, and those of you who have given your oral evidence in court, be assured that I in particular am taking great note and studying in great care all the things that you said. Very valuable. Also, the witness descriptions of how smoke and flames penetrated different flats, the lobbies and the stair, are also providing me with a good understanding of these aspects, which I'm using to validate my generic predictions of likely smoke development, spread, and composition. Also, I mentioned the importance of carboxyhemoglobin. Well, we do have some blood toxicology data for Grenfell. The blood samples are available for, actually there were about 20 fatalities, but there was only 15 of those for which the toxicologist was able to assign a numerical value for the carboxyhemoglobin in their blood. Now, some of these people died in flats, some in lobbies, and some on the stair. I've also viewed photographs of the remains of these fatalities. I'm currently awaiting the full autopsy reports, which I will consider as part of phase 2. So this information, taken together with the witness accounts and the emergency call transcripts, considered in the context of data from previous incidents, is providing me, I feel, with a good basis for assessment of causes of incapacitation and death for Grenfell fatalities. Now, I just want to briefly, at this point, before I go more deeply into some of this material, address one very important issue, which is, were the Grenfell fatalities affected by exposure to heat or burns before they died? Or were they overcome by toxic smoke? Now, I stress that my work is still preliminary, but from my review of the Grenfell-specific evidence so far, and taken in light of data from previous incidents, it's a strong possibility that those who died did so from smoke inhalation rather than being burned. And I'm placing particular emphasis here on the available carboxyhemoglobin data. I'd also want to point out that while inhalation exposure to irritant smoke can be quite unpleasant and cause breathing difficulties and discomfort, exposure to these asphyxiant gases, people are totally unaware that they're inhaling them, that they have no real effect until the point where you suddenly feel dizzy and collapse. So dying from carbon monoxide, even if there's cyanide in the mixture, is not a painful death. You basically faint and then go into slowly a coma and die. And I think that might be important to the...
Would that be a good point to have a break?
Yes.
Yes, all right. Well, we do have a break roughly every hour. We'll take one now.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you, please, not to discuss your evidence with anyone once you leave the room. And we'll resume at 11:15. And if you'd like to go with the usher, that gives you just over 10 minutes, is that right?
Yes, it's fine.
Yes. If you go to the usher, she'll look after you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Right, 11:15, please. Right, Professor. All right, you happy to carry on?
Yes, if we can get the display.
Yes, you're cut off at the moment, but
I may have ended the presentation. We might have to get someone to start it again. Let's see what happens.
oh, right. We've got the experts on the job.
Yeah, so just went to sleep.
Oh. No idea, sorry.
It's just the computer went to sleep.
Oh, right, okay. There's the password. There we are.
I think this is where we got to.
Is it right?
Yeah.
So,
You're right, can you pick it up from there?
I think so, yeah. Just go back. I remember what I said last.
Well, we had that one. Yep. Yep.
Oh yes, we've done that one.
Yep, done that. And that one.
Right.
Yeah. Well done.
Okay. Now, apart from the Rose Park study that I mentioned earlier, some very useful work I think I was involved in quite a long time ago now was some full-scale reconstruction fires, looking at typical domestic fire scenarios. This was when I was at PRE, and in those days we had an experimental house, like a typical semi-detached house of the time, in a big hangar in Cardington, in Bedfordshire, where we could do the experiments. And we carried out a series of fires, looking at the toxic hazards from upholstered furniture. So all these fires involved setting fire to armchairs, basically, as shown in the bottom left there. And we had them in a sort of flat rig, with a room, corridor and a bedroom. But we also had this two-storey house where we did most of the tests. And what I want to explore with you is, particularly here, is the hazard faced by somebody who was upstairs during such a fire. So what happened in these fires was we ignite the furniture, and this is also true for anybody who's in the room with the fire downstairs. And that is that initially, the conditions are reasonably benign. You could stand here in that room and watch this fire when it's that sort of size. But if you can just make it out, already a layer of smoke is building up under the ceiling. So any toxic products that are formed by this smoke and any heat is taken up the ceiling. So if you were in the room down here, you're not immediately exposed to them. That layer of smoke gradually fills down, a bit like an inverted bathtub filling with water, until, in many of these fires, we had the room to the hallway open. In some, we had it closed. And when we have the room door open, when the smoke gets below the level of the top of the doorway, called the soffit, the smoke flows out into the hall, upstairs, and mixes with air and fills the landing above, and all open areas within the house. Because this is an enclosed system, after 10 minutes or so, these fires self-extinguished. They went out because they used up sufficient oxygen for the fire to stop burning. But this left this house filled with a highly toxic atmosphere, evenly distributed throughout all the open spaces. Upstairs we had a closed bedroom, which we measured conditions in, and we also had an open bedroom. And this is the conditions in the landing here. So you've got 5,500 ppm of carbon monoxide. You've got 5% carbon dioxide, which stimulates breathing and increases the rate of uptake of other gases. You have some decrease in oxygen, but not too worrying. But you also have a very high concentration of cyanide, which is caused by burning the foam in the furniture and the covers in the furniture. You also have here, we measured these irritant organic chemicals that sting your eyes and make it difficult to breathe. And of course, it's hot. But, as I told you before, in relation to Rose Park, although it may be very hot in this room here, by the time the smoke has come and mixed and gone upstairs, and the structure has absorbed some of the heat, the temperature actually on the landing here is not too bad. It's 60 degrees centigrade. Now, you wouldn't want to spend all day at 60. I mean, it's well below the temperature of a sauna, for example. But you'd sense that it was hot. And what I would like to kind of explore with you is the dilemma, if you like, or the conditions faced by somebody who might have been asleep in this bedroom here. By the way, these photographs, this is the top of the stairs looking down early in the fire, and the right-hand side shows the view, the camera view, about 5 minutes later. And you can see by that time, you can't see anything either in the room where the fire is, or crucially, upstairs on the landing. It's hand in front of your face. You can't see the hand in front of your face, which is something that was said by many Grenfell occupants when they tried to step out of their front door into the lobby at Grenfell. So what will this person do in this situation? Let's suppose they're asleep and the smoke alarm goes off. So they go to this door, which is closed, and they open it, and what are they faced by? They're faced by this dense smoke. And a bit of it's going to come in and it'll sting their eyes and be very unpleasant. So obviously their first reaction is most likely to be to shut the door and stay in the bedroom. They will then either remain there, maybe they'll call the fire service, or they may try it, and being a two-storey house, they may attempt to escape through the window. Now, I've come across many examples of this in real life, and I've known people who have done exactly this. That they've opened the door, they've found conditions very frightening, and in one particular recent case I worked on, they actually got out and came down a drain pipe to escape, 3 young people. In another one, which is quite interesting in this context, a man woke like this. He started to go down the stairs, and as he said, as I tried to go down the stairs, I felt that it was hot. Not painful, but just, something wrong. And of course it was very smoky and irritant. And of course he didn't know what was below him. It could have been a raging inferno for all he knew. So halfway down the stairs, he turned around and went back, took refuge in the bedroom and called the fire brigade from where he was rescued. So in this case here, with these gases, if this person stepped out now onto the landing, what would happen to them? Well, the first thing would be that they can't see. The second thing, within seconds, is they would be suffering from the irritants, which would affect their vision, their breathing, and be very unpleasant. If they don't turn back at that point but continue, at some point they're going to start taking some breaths, and they will be inhaling these very high concentrations of asphyxiant gases. And in my example here, they've gone a few steps, and then because of that, they've collapsed at the bottom of the stair. Now, as I said before, they're still alive, but they're continuing to breathe these toxic gases. If they're rescued at that point and treated with oxygen in the ambulance, they may make a good recovery. If they've had a more severe exposure, as did my 4 cases at Rose Park, then they may suffer permanent brain damage, and from which they'd never recover. There may be a common finding is that people who've been poisoned by carbon monoxide, even if they don't have obvious neurological symptoms, they suffer from personality changes. Or they may be, they're so badly affected they never recover consciousness. Alternatively, they may have inhaled a dose of smoke sufficient, and this is a fairly common occurrence, that several hours, about 3 hours after the time of exposure, they may go through a crisis where they get lung edema and inflammation. So the irritant smoke they've inhaled causes water to build up on the lung, and that makes it very difficult to breathe. And so they may actually die at that point, or they may, with treatment, come through it. So these are the kind of hazards that people will face. And on the next slide here, I show the FED analysis for this case of somebody stepping out onto that landing. And the first thing, so we're looking for when any of these lines crosses 1 on this scale, right down here. And what this shows is that the concentration of irritant smoke is immediately about 15 times the concentration that would be predicted to give you difficulty in progressing through it and breathing it. Wouldn't kill you, but it would make things difficult. Secondly, because of the asphyxiant gases here, I'm predicting that the overall effect, which are additive of these different gases, would cause, after a couple of breaths in that particular atmosphere, the person is likely to collapse unconscious. And when I remove the cyanide, they've got 150 seconds. So you can see here, in this case, the presence or absence of cyanide could make a significant difference to whether they're able to get down the stairs and out through the front door, which would only take 10, 20 seconds or so. Okay, so that's an example of a sort of scenario or situation that was faced by a lot of Grenfell occupants. And there's the two sides to this. There's the behavioural side and the sort of physiological side. So the behavioural side of it is, I've got this very difficult decision to make, which was faced by Grenfell occupants, in some cases, several times during the course of the fire. Early in the fire, you open the door, you see smoke. Maybe this was after about 1:30 on the morning of the fire, when there was a lot of smoke in those lobbies. And you have to make this difficult decision. Do I stay put? Or do I decide to try and make it to the stair and go out? If I go to the stair and get out, that's over. But if I decide to stay put, I may then have to revisit this decision later on as conditions deteriorate outside the flat. So I think that example shows you some of the issues that people were facing and the consequences of doing one thing or the other. I just want to briefly now just talk a little bit about some of these different hazards. And the first one is smoke. And this is some work that was done years ago by Professor Jin in Japan, where he got volunteers to walk down a corridor while being exposed to smoke, to see how their movement speed and ability to progress was affected. And what Professor Jin found was that when he used non-irritant smoke, which is this blue line here, people with no smoke walked at about 1 to 1.1 metre per second. That's typical walking speed. But once the smoke density got such that you could only see about 2 metres, their behaviour changed from walking as if they could see to walking as if they're feeling their way in darkness. Do you understand? And feeling their way along the walls and things like that. And at that point, their speed was greatly reduced to 0.3 metres a second. But when he replaced the smoke with irritant smoke, he found that the same phenomenon occurred at a 5 metre optical density. The combination of optical and irritancy gave the same effect. So although theoretically you could see for 4 or 5 metres, you were still affected. So that's the physical effect on progress. But the other effect that's more important in some ways, or as important, is the behavioural effect. And I've summed that up very in one line almost here. But there are 2 big studies done, one in actually at the BRE Fire Research Station by Dr. Wood, and one in America by Professor Bryan at the University of Maryland, where Terrero is current. In fact, Terrero is now the Bryan Professor at Maryland, and I've taught at Maryland. So what these people did was they measured, they analysed a lot of incidents, and they were looking at this kind of decision-making at when do people decide to continue, or what smoke conditions will they turn back. And they found, simplifying it, that once you get to about 4 metres visibility, quite a large proportion of people will turn back rather than continue through the smoke. So just the density of the smoke, and to some extent its irritancy, because these are real incidents, is having a profound effect on their escape behaviour and capability. However, I would point out that I believe that this effect, and from the studies I've made, is very much depends on the context. Right? So if you imagine somebody who's in, for example, a Grenfell flat, and the flat fills with smoke, this could be like a flat 6, and the column of flats in the flat 6 location in the tower. During the early stages of the fire comes in and the smoke comes in from outside and fills your flat. No matter how dense that smoke is, you're going to be very highly motivated to get to your front door and out into the lobby, which at that time was relatively smoke-free. So I would say that whatever the density, you will try. And I've come across lots of instances where people have moved through very dense smoke, as indeed they did at Grenfell. On the other hand, if you're in a reasonably smoke-free flat, and you open the door and see dense smoke in the lobby, then you're much more likely to stay where you are and shut the door. So it depends on the context. The other thing is I want to talk about is the asphyxiants. And again, it's the difference between, why there's a difference really between cyanide and carbon monoxide. And in these experiments here, subjects were exposed to carbon monoxide at different concentrations on the right-hand axis here. And what we're looking for is the dose, which is roughly the concentration to which they were exposed, multiplied by the time at which, until they became unconscious. And so you can see here at the top left hand there, when they were exposed for 1,000 parts per million, then collapse occurred unconscious after 26.6 minutes. If you multiply those two figures together, you get 26,600 ppm minutes. Right? That's a sort of measure of dose. When they were exposed at the bottom of that column to 800 ppm, here,
You mean 8,000?
8,000, sorry, thank you. Then they collapsed after about 3 minutes. And multiplying the two together gives you roughly the same number. So there's a very clear relationship that over this time scales at least, the effects of CO are purely dose related. But this contrasts with the effect of cyanide here. Now with cyanide, when they were exposed to 87 parts per million, then they were able to function for half an hour. Multiplying those two together gives you 2,610. But at 300 ppm, they collapsed after 0.9 of a minute, very, very quickly. Multiply those together, you get 270. So what this tells us is that a long exposure to a low concentration, which in this context is less than 100 parts per million of cyanide, can be tolerated quite well. But if you're exposed to twice that concentration, say 2 to 300, then you're going to collapse within a couple of minutes. And that's partly why I believe cyanide causes incapacitation in fires. Not necessarily death, but incapacitation. This slide is about carboxyhemoglobin in blood. And this study on the left here was done by Professor Gordon Nelson in the United States, and it's a study of a very large forensic database of people who have died from carbon monoxide poisoning, essentially, either in fires or from CO poisoning itself. So the green bars here are the concentrations of carboxyhemoglobin in the blood of fatalities of people who have died from accidental carbon monoxide exposure, either caused by faulty home heaters, faulty boilers, things like that, or in this case, it's quite an old database, mostly young men committing suicide by exposing themselves to exhaust fumes in the garage, before we had catalytic converters. And what this shows is that there's quite a range of sensitivity in the population before people actually die, but most of these people have got at least 40 to 50% or more. The most common, most frequent dose at death is between 70 and 80% carboxyhemoglobin. A few people survive until they're nearly 100%, amazingly, before they actually die. Now, if you compare that to the red bars, which are for people who've died in fires but not burned, then you can see that it follows roughly the same pattern. And that gives us some confidence that the main cause of asphyxiant death in fires is in fact carbon monoxide. That's the main agent causing death, or it's consistent with that. However, there is a bit of a left shift here. There are some people here. And so this tells us that there's something else as well in fires that's contributing. Although CO is the main thing, there's something else. And that may well be cyanide and some other things in fires. Now, the right-hand curve is from a Polish researcher. His name is Pach, P-A-C-H. And this is about survival as opposed to death. So in this case, these are people who have been rescued having had carbon monoxide poisoning. And the probability that with treatment they would survive. And what this shows is that up to about 30% carboxyhemoglobin here, everybody survives. But then you see the survival rate drops off very quickly, and the 50% survival rate, which is what toxicologists look for, is indeed at 50% carboxyhemoglobin, whereas very few people survive having had 60 to 80% carboxyhemoglobin. And in the next slide, I've compared Patch's data to the Rose Park data. So here we have all the people who were dead in their rooms very quickly at Rose Park, and you see they're all in this very high COHB group. They've died from smoke poisoning. As well, the reason I'm going into this in such detail is because of what we're going to see in the Grenfell victims. These are the 4 ladies who were rescued alive but then died in hospital. They're in the middle, almost at this 50% point. And these are the ones that survived. So we've got good agreement with the Polish data. This slide shows, it's from a London Fire Brigade database, of the burns and carboxyhemoglobin in fire fatalities in the London area. I think it was for one particular year, and I forget the exact year. But the point about this is that we have not only a record of the extent of burns, the white bars are burns, and the grey bars are serious, possibly life-threatening burns. The black is the number of cases with different levels of carboxyhemoglobin. And importantly, these 2 pictures, one is for people who are not in the same room as the fire, and this is for people who are in the same room as the fire. And what you can see is that most people who have died in a room other than the fire room, so for example, in a bedroom at Grenfell when the fire's in the lounge, all have very high carboxyhemoglobin levels. And they've all, and very little, if any, burns. So these are people dying from smoke inhalation. Whereas in the room of fire origin, there are quite a lot of people who have very low carboxyhemoglobin levels, less than about 20 or so, and a high incidence of burns. So these are people who basically have died from burns before they had time to inhale a high dose of carbon monoxide. And so if we find certain levels in a body of a person who's died, and that body then gets burned, but we find these very high concentrations, that's really, in most cases, that tells us that they died from carbon monoxide or smoke poisoning rather than from burns. If they've got only 10 or 20%, then we suspect that it may have been heat and burns that killed them. And so what I'm telling you is that all the Grenfell cases are up here somewhere. Very briefly, this is the effect of how we calculate time to effect from heat. There are 2 kinds of heat exposure in fires. One is heat radiation, which comes directly from the fire and from the hot upper layer when you have hot smoke. And the other is that if you're enveloped in smoke and exposed to hot air, hot atmosphere, then this is human data on time of tolerance. And there is one important point I want to draw to your attention for this curve, which is that at 200 degrees centigrade in air, it's possible for volunteers to tolerate that for several minutes before they start to feel pain to their exposed skin. And this is some relevance to Grenfell because you may remember Dr. Lane found that some of the light diffusers in the stair, I believe it was between floors 12 and 16, around there, and I went and saw these myself, were softened by heat. So she decided that the temperature in the stair may have been in this sort of region. And I'm saying that even if it was as hot as that, especially above head height, where it had been cooler lower down, people could still have got through those few floors without necessarily suffering severely, although in reality, I think this may have occurred after most people had moved. I want to talk a little bit now about scenarios, and we've talked about some, obviously, here. So, because these are the enclosed scenarios I've described, one important point about these, which I'm going to talk about a bit later, is that when a fire first starts to burn in an enclosed room, initially, if I set fire to this laptop here, we'll have lots of nice fresh air from the room coming in to support the flaming combustion. Right? The result of that is that the combustion is very efficient, and so that generally the products of combustion are carbon dioxide, water and heat. And anyway, all that goes up to the ceiling, so we're all safe for a while, you'll be pleased to hear, and it forms a layer under the ceiling, and it's some time before we're exposed to it. But if the room is enclosed, this layer quickly fills down, and once the flames are burning in their own smoke, as it were, in this oxygen-depleted layer, then the combustion process becomes very inefficient. And the products of inefficient combustion are a big increase in the yields of carbon monoxide from any carbon in the fuel, smoke itself, that goes up, and if there's any nitrogen in the fuel, you start to generate a lot of hydrogen cyanide, and that's what's happened in these furniture fires here. Now, briefly, I will address this now, just in passing. This may have some relevance to the conditions when the PIR was burning on the outside of the tower, because the PIR insulation, initially at least, is encased in a cavity with the rain screen cladding outside it. So it's in a sort of enclosed space, like a big pipe, almost. When a fire occurs in that material, at the bottom of the area where the flaming is, it's exposed to quite good air conditions. There's air coming up from below, and there's the fuel being exposed, and the two combine to combust. And those products then continue up due to buoyancy. And those products then are now depleted in oxygen, but the heat from the fire is likely to decompose the same material higher up the pipe. And that material decomposed higher up the pipe is now going to encounter those thermal decomposition products, we call them, are going to encounter a hot plume which is depleted in oxygen. And what is important in this context is the fuel-air ratio at various points. So when there's excessive air for combustion, as in this case, then combustion is efficient. But when there's more fuel than air, as in this case, or possibly may have occurred for a period in some of this cladding, insulation, then you tend to get higher yields of toxic products. The term that we use for this is the equivalence ratio, which is a relation to the fuel-air ratio. So when the equivalence ratio is less than 1, that's efficient combustion, low toxicity. When this ratio is greater than 1, you can get highly toxic products. Going back to these room fires, though, there's another important aspect, because all the fire tests I've described to you so far were conducted in enclosed situations where the fire grew, then became underventilated, and then more or less went out. Now, at Grenfell, that would be sort of equivalent to fire coming in around a closed window on the outside of Grenfell, which was described by some people. So you may have fire in your flat, but at this point the windows are still intact. That would be a sort of situation similar to these room fires. Instead of the furniture burning, it's materials, structural materials, initially at least, around the window area, and may then spread to involve the contents. And that's going to remain a relatively small fire, and it's going to become very toxic, very poisonous very quickly. But a very different situation occurs if the window is fully open, or in particular, as at Grenfell, if the window glazing fails and the whole window falls out. Now, when that happens, you're in this kind of situation, where you have continuous air coming in through the bottom of the window to feed the fire. The fire can then get bigger and hotter, and it will continue to burn. It can continue to burn until all the fuel, including all the contents, is burned away. And a consequence of this is that the fire, the upper layer, becomes very hot, and the downward thermal radiation from the hot upper layer, once it gets to about 600 degrees centigrade, can ignite fuels remote from where the fire is starting. So you may have a fire initially burning near the windows, and the hot plume is flowing towards the back of the flat. Once those temperatures get so high, even those materials can ignite. And there's a very clear example of this here from experiments that we carried out at BRE many years ago. On the right here, although you can't make it out in the shot, this is a sofa that we ignited. You see, it's burning fiercely. And this is the point of flashover, because this hot upper layer now is radiating down, and you can perhaps just see it's just igniting all the sort of newspapers and various materials on this occasional table. So that is the exact point at which flashover occurred in this room. Now, as you can see, these conditions are extreme, and certainly nobody could survive for more than a few seconds in that room. But one of the questions is, what would happen to them in the rest of the flat? Would they be able to survive any longer if they took refuge? And I think conditions like this would be difficult to survive for more than a few minutes, even if you took refuge somewhere, although it's quite a complicated situation, and there are many different variants we've observed in different flats at Grenfell. Just to say that we had these different rigs. I mentioned the flat rig, and this was the open rig, where we studied these more developed fires. I'm going to go a bit quicker now, I think I'll cover most of this. So this just illustrates the conditions in one of these furniture fires with time as it goes on. So you can see after 5 minutes you can't see anything if you're in that room. But the amount of damage you can see here is quite small. And I think on these slides and in my report I've mentioned a number of times that in order to create lethal conditions in the enclosed volume of a flat or house, you really only need to burn about 5 to 7 kilograms of material, which represents in this case about a third to a half of that armchair. That was enough to make lethal conditions in the house. And this slide shows the conditions. There's the landing again, and this is you can't see anything after 5 minutes. Top right shows the FED for the occupants of the open bedroom upstairs. And the crucial difference here is that although they were going to be overcome by the same smoke very quickly, they're not troubled by heat, because the heat has gone. There's heat downstairs, but it's been lost from this more sheltered place. This slide compares the smoke in a situation where we've closed the lounge door and measured the smoke throughout the house. And an example, this is an ordinary door, not a fire door. And then we've measured so the left-hand one is the enclosed fire, the right-hand one is one with the door open. And it's a bit hard to understand here, but basically this is the smoke density, and these lines here are inside the closed room, and you can see they very rapidly go up at the top of the graph. But the conditions in the hallway and landing and other rooms are much less smoky. And this demonstrated that if you're in an ordinary two-bedroom house, and you've taken the trouble to shut the lounge door before you go to bed, if you have a fire in your lounge, you have a very good chance of getting past it to the front door if you shut the door. But if you leave the door open, then as you can see just at a glance, the whole of the house rapidly gets filled with dense toxic smoke. This shows the condition in Rose Park for somebody taking refuge in a closed bedroom, closed room. And you see the contrast. Instead of having these rapidly increasing concentrations, you've got a very, very slow, gradual filling up over a period of an hour or so, and uptake of carboxyhemoglobin by the occupants. So this shows how somebody who's taken refuge in a flat, for example, at Grenfell, which happened in many cases, the situation was that they found themselves that when they opened the front door to the landing, they couldn't see. Was hand in front of the face, darkness, so they were then trapped in the flat for maybe an hour or so at Grenfell, and they would have been facing a situation like this with a slowly building up dose. Right, I think we're nearly there. So for any given, now for any given smoke visibility, how far can people go before they collapse from asphyxia? These examples that I've shown you, fire scenarios and effects, can be useful to estimate the likely experience of effects on Grenfell occupants exposed in similar situations, including staying in flats with rapid smoke, slow smoke, and going into lobbies. But because the time concentration curves of smoke gases throughout the Grenfell, we don't have that information like I do for the tests. Is there another way we can come at it? Well, one set of information we do have is descriptions by the witnesses of the smoke density and toxicity at different times and locations from the witness statements and the 999 emergency calls. And because the ratio of smoke density to concentration is a constant, I can use this to predict what would happen. I'm going to speed up a bit here and show you this graph here. So basically, this is an image of the visibility compared with time to collapse. So because the smoke visibility and the other toxic gases are tracking together in the fire, if you know the smoke is dense, you know there's a high concentrations of the gases. If the visibility is good, then you have low concentrations. So if, for example, you had somebody in a flat in Grenfell and they could see for 3 meters, they said, oh, there was smoke coming in the flat, I was there for half an hour, but I could see across the room. How dangerous is that smoke? Well, this graph tells me that after, say, half an hour, you're nowhere near half a dose that would cause incapacitation. But then let's say that person, having been there for half an hour, then steps out onto the landing and they can't see their hand in front of their face. Then according to this curve, you then only have 2 or 3 minutes further before you'd collapse. So I think this can help us to see how exposure to different smoke densities correlates with the asphyxiant gas concentrations at different times and locations at Grenfell. So in summary, using data from past incidents and full-scale experiments coupled with FED physiological methods for calculating time to incapacitation and death, it's possible to identify a set of fire exposure scenarios occurring at Grenfell and the likely effects on occupants. By expressing the FED tenability as a function of visibility, as I did in the last slide, it's possible to estimate the hazards from irritant smoke and asphyxiant gases at different times and locations at Grenfell from witness accounts of visibility and reported toxicity symptoms. Percent carboxyhemoglobin measurements in the blood of some Grenfell fatalities related to that from previous incidents can be used to determine the extent of exposure of these fatalities to toxic smoke or heat and burns. And that's the end of that presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now,
I'm trying to keep up.
Well done. Would you like another break at this point? Have you got to load something else on next?
I want the next presentation. Yeah.
Yes. Well, would this be a good time to have a short break?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We'll do that now. Just for my benefit, how long is the next presentation? Do you think?
Just under an hour, I'm afraid.
Right. So
I'm hoping we can at least get through that one before lunch.
well, if we came back at 12:05,
Yeah.
you reckon you'd finish by 1 o'clock?
Yes.
Should-
Then I've got the third presentation. That looks like that's going to have to go in, which is a shorter one, but I think that's going to go into the afternoon, is it?
All right. Well,
Well, I'm happy to do it this morning.
we'll get on to that when
See how we go.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can't push people too hard. They need their lunch.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll stop now until 12:05.
Yes.
Again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when you're out of the room,
Right.
and go with the usher. She'll look after you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. That's all right. All right. 12:05, please. Thank you. from here.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I hope Professor Purse's second presentation has been loaded, should start, but before he begins, can I just repeat the trigger warning that we gave this morning, just because I think people
Excuse me, we're going to see some more potentially disturbing material.
And the nature of the presentation may be distressing in itself as we get into it.
Well, thank you for making that clear. Right, are you ready to go on, Professor?
Yes, I'm fine.
Good, thank you.
Okay, so for this second presentation, I want to address some of the effects that are believed to actually be happening in the Grenfell incident. And before I get into the detail of this, I just want to remind you of some slides, some information that Dr. Lane put up about the 5 requirements in the building regulations. And the one I want to focus on particularly, if you remember, she told us that there has to be adequate means of escape, that essentially each flat should be a fire-resisting box, and that the fire should not be able to get out of the flat. The lining should not propagate fire, and there shouldn't be external fire spread. But the one I want to focus on is the means of warning and escape. The building shall be designed and constructed so that there are appropriate provisions for the early warning of fire and appropriate means of escape in case of fire from the building to a place of safety outside the building, capable of being safely and effectively used at all material times. So that's a fundamental requirement of the building regulations. Now in Grenfell, the design attempted to achieve that, partly, as I said, by the fire-resisting construction, but we do have a means of escape. We had detection in each flat. There were detectors in the flats. And then you have corridors, hallways in each flat to enable a person to escape away from the fire in their flat in safety into the lobby. The front flat entrance door is a fire-resisting door which should resist both fire and smoke contamination of the lobby. So once you're in the lobby, you should be in a smoke-free environment. And then we have an extra layer of protection before we come to the concrete protected shaft of the stair as a smoke door, fire door on the stair itself. So we have these provisions at Grenfell. But we also have a stay-put policy. And a stay-put policy means that people are encouraged basically to remain in their flats most of the times. And there's a lot of statistics on this. Many times when there are fires in a flat, in a home or a tower block, it's restricted to that single, or in a tower block, to a single dwelling. And so there is no need, in many cases, for people to evacuate. However, the important point is that should things change, so that they become uncomfortable because of the situation or because, say, smoke or fire comes to another flat in the block, there should still be this preserved escape route out that should be free of smoke and fire at all times. Now, clearly, these requirements were failed, all of them, at some time at Grenfell. And for my investigation, then, I'm trying to decide how and when smoke and flames penetrated individual flats. At the beginning, particularly on the east side of the tower. So we've got a column of flats, basically flat 6 on each floor, that are first affected by penetration from the exterior fire moving up the structure. When and how did that happen? How then did dense smoke penetrate into the lobbies? And how did this affect the behaviour, escape capability and survival of the occupants? When did it get into the stair and have effects in the stair? And then when later other flats were penetrated by fire, how did that happen and what did it do? Now I just want to briefly talk a bit about the stair at Grenfell. And why do I want to do that? Well,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to be clear because Professor Purse's slides are not coming up on the system.
I beg your pardon.
Oh, well, I was waiting to see one.
I was ploughing on great gusto there, and you can't see anything.
I understand, Mr. Chairman, that it's being looked into. So it might be a technical.
How many slides have we missed, Professor?
I won't talk to them. I'll just flash them up when it comes back on, so to remind people.
Yeah, but are we talking about 3 or 4?
Yeah, only 3 or 4.
Yeah, and we'll do that. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Sorry, let me get it away. they're mostly text slides anyway, and so I've really
So you've
counted
spoken to
what's
them already?
yeah.
All right, well, that's fine then. No,
That's
there
it?
you are. Yes.
Oh, presentation mode.
No?
Yeah, we're away. Thank you.
Yeah, well, this reflects the
Building regulations.
yeah, and this is what you've just been telling us anyway,
describing
so
this.
we can probably go on from here.
Yeah, so
can't we?
that's the one about means of escape.
Yeah.
And this is the diagram of the layout,
Yeah.
showing the various points I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I'm saying is that these are what I'm trying to determine. And I want to talk a bit about the stair. The reason I'm interested in the stair is because my mission, if you like, is to consider the effects of exposure to toxic smoke. One place you can be exposed to toxic smoke is in the stair. Mm-hmm. And whether or not you're able to get down the stair without collapsing depends partly how long it takes you to get down the stair. And so if, for example, we assume that there are approximately 293 persons in Grenfell Tower on the night of the fire, let's suppose that around about 1 o'clock, they'd all simultaneously attempted to get into the stair and come down the building. How long would it have taken them to do so? If that would have taken an hour and that smoke filled the stair, then that's a long time to be exposed. Mm. So how long would it have taken? Well, I've done a lot of work on evacuations and drills and things like that. So for a building designed for simultaneous evacuation, approved document B assumes in its calculations, which are hidden within the document, a standing density on the stair of 4 persons per metre squared. So the idea is that the population could move into the stair of such a building, stand on the steps and on the landings in the stair, and be in a protected space. But that would be very dense packing, and you wouldn't be able to move. You'd have to wait for the building to clear from below you. Now, in practice, when I've carried out experiments of this kind, I found that people will not pack to that level of density. And they typically will crowd, if you like, to the extent of 2 persons per square metre. Now, at that density, you would still be moving quite slowly as you came down in a group, but you'd be able to move reasonably well. Now, at the packing density of 2 persons per square metre, there would be room for about 460 persons in the Grenfell stair. And we've got 290. So you can see that would be 20 persons per floor. If the 293 at Grenfell went in, that's 13 per floor, which is 1 person roughly per metre. So even in the extreme case, where everybody went in at once, there'd be plenty of space and free movement available physically in the Grenfell stair. Now, my colleague, Professor Gallia, who you haven't heard from yet, but is working for phase 2, he will be doing an in-depth analysis of this, but I'm just pointing these basic things out at the moment. So even in the extreme case, there'd be plenty of room in the stair for people to move freely. Now, how long does it take to come down? Well, when I was at Grenfell, I timed myself coming down the stair. And I was wearing protective clothing, heavy boots, sort of respirator, very restrictive clothing. And at the time, I was 73 years old. And I found I was able to descend at a rate of 9.3 seconds per floor, which represents time to get to the bottom nominally of 23 floors from the very top of 3.5 minutes. So that's a person on their own in an empty stair descending on their own. Now, but evacuation time of a crowd in a building, we've got a 1 metre wide stair. The maximum flow rate of people down the stair is calculated according to a fairly standard formula. And for a 1 metre wide stair, that would be about 42 persons per minute could flow down and out of the bottom of that stair. And so if there were 293 people in the building, that would represent if you like, an ideal nominal evacuation time of the whole population to the lobby in 7 minutes if they all suddenly went into the stair. Quite a short period of time. Now, of course, in practice, we have children, elderly people, some of them disabled, and they may be slower, and also they may block the stair to some extent. But I confirmed it was able to pass somebody on the Grenfell stair, and indeed many occupants report, especially the slow ones, people coming past them on the stair. So there was possible to overtake. It was also possible they reported going past fire officers who were in the stairwell with equipment. So although the single stair at Grenfell was quite narrow, there was a good handrail and the physical capacity was sufficient for all occupants to be evacuated safely within minutes if there had been some means of alerting them to evacuate, such as, for example, a general tower alarm system, which of course we didn't have. So what did people do in practice? Well, despite the lack of a general simultaneous alarm system in the tower, the majority of tower occupants became aware of the fire at a very early stage. I get this from my studies of the witness statements. And they picked up from a variety of cues, which I've listed here, but I won't read them all out. But it's things like noises, fire engines, smelling smoke. In some cases, there are detectors going on. And they all, many people, on all floors, even right to the very top, realised at a very early stage there was something serious going on. And many of them decided to evacuate at that point. And some of them decided to go down just to investigate because they were worried about what might be happening below. Others made the decision that it was serious and to get out. And I've tried to summarise this and depict it in this slide here on the right. Now, one thing I realised when I started to read these statements and study the evacuation times that were recorded was that there was a very different set of behaviours on the top 6 floors of the tower, floors 18 to 23. There was a lot of interaction between people within and between those floors. So it makes a kind of group, a little community, if you like, that were doing certain things. And so on this graph here, I've plotted the number of people who were in those that's this red line here, the top 6 floors, and their evacuation from the tower. And then because I'd done the top 6 floors, I then went down the tower in groups of 6 floors. So the next chunk, if you like, the next group is floors 12 to 17, which is the black line, and then floors 6 to 11, which is the brown line. And that left me with 2 floors towards the bottom, the fire floor, floor 4, and the floor above that, floor 5, which is the blue line. And these 2 vertical lines here are quite important because the red line is the point in time when, from studying the witness statements, I believe that most lobbies became filled with dense smoke that people couldn't see through. Now, obviously, this is not a point in time, it's a process. But this provides a good sort of anchor point from when smoke conditions became serious in the lobbies. And what you can see here is that very, very many... now, the times on here are not the times people exited the building. They're the times I've estimated from those times that they started. So when they entered the stair, wherever they were. And I've done that using a very simple calculation, so it's only an estimate, where I've assumed that you descend at a rate of 12 seconds per floor. So from that, from the exit time, allowing 12 seconds per floor, I can calculate the slightly earlier time at which the person entered the stair, whatever floor they were on. Okay? Well, that's what's depicted here. And what this shows is that many, many people started to evacuate very early on. And indeed, nearly all these people here on these floors started to evacuate before there was significant smoke in the lobbies. And they were able to make an effective and safe descent because there was virtually no smoke in the stair at that time either. But after that time, the stair is still relatively clear of smoke, but the lobbies are full of dense smoke. So now we have a period where people are opening their flat doors and either deciding to brave going through the smoke or they say, it's too dangerous, I'm going to stay put. People who did venture out into the lobby had great difficulty finding their way to the stair. And a bit like Professor Jin's work, they're feeling their way, and they described along the walls. And some of them had several attempts. They had to go back to their flats, maybe have some fresh air from a window, and then they'd try again. And eventually they found their way to the door leading to the stair, opened it, got into the stair, and this is this period here. And when they got into the stair, they found there was some smoke in the stair, but they could see several metres, and it wasn't too onerous. And they were also able to descend safely. But on floors, the top floors here, there was a different kind of pattern of behaviour that emerged, which is something I need to get into in a lot more detail to understand what was going on. But basically, a lot of these people did decide at a very early stage to evacuate the tower. And I believe what's actually happened here is that crucial in this was the behaviour of people on floors 18 and 19. Quite a lot of those people decided to evacuate. They started to come down the stair, and then for some reason they just turned back and went back up. And they went back up to the 23rd floor, in most cases. And so instead of coming out of the tower, they took refuge in other flats within the tower. Also affected were other people, particularly on floors 20 to 23, who had made a decision very early on. I'm talking about before 0130. They decided things were getting bad. They'd been alerted by people probably from flat 6 who were having fire coming into their flats, and they decided we ought to get out. But when they went to the door to the stair to decide to come down, they were confronted by this knot of people ascending, and they said, well, I've got some statements here. They were saying, oh, I was going to go down the stair, but these people were coming up saying it's not possible to go down. And anyway, they were blocking the stair, so I was unable to do so. So quite a lot of those people also ended up staying either on their own floor or a different floor, taking refuge in flats, who otherwise probably would have descended at that time. This is just a summary of some accounts from different witnesses who describe the conditions in the stair, how they were able to overtake and various things like that. I won't read these out. But I just want to, this question of why people turned back and didn't come down is so crucial, I think, that we need to spend a little time thinking about it. And so, if you forgive me, I'd like to read out a couple of statements. And this is from Maren Mekkonen's statement. She was in flat 163 on the 19th floor. Now, she left her flat, I estimated, approximately 0127, when conditions in both the lobby and the stair were reasonably good. But she ended up going back and then tried again a few minutes later. So I'll just read this out. Amal's relative had remained on the landing and started to follow me and my children down the stairs. We had not gone far down the stairs, though I do not remember which floor we had reached, when we met a group of approximately 10 people on the stairwell. They all seemed to be other residents of the tower. Someone below us shouted out, "Go back, go back." The group, including me, my two girls and Amal's relative, all started moving back up the stairs, i.e. up the tower. I got to the top of the stairs on my floor. I did not want to go back into my flat, so I decided to ignore the advice that had been shouted in the stairwell to go back up, and I headed back down the stairs with my daughters. The next bit is also very important. There was no one on the stairwell at this point. So this knot of people had gone, and the stair was now empty, or relatively empty. As we were walking down the stairs, the smoke was becoming thicker and thicker, so this may be a factor. It was dense and dark grey, but I could see through it. I was able to breathe without any difficulty. Now, there may be a number of reasons why this group of people turned back, and of course, especially if you're near the top of the stair, the tower, and you're coming down towards the fire, it's a very frightening situation. You don't really know what's going to be happening below you. And this may be why, particularly the upper part, people were more reluctant to come down. But it could also be that they were starting to encounter a little bit of smoke in the stair and thinking, well, it's going maybe a lot worse lower down. But well, for whatever reason, this was a crucial event in the incident. This is a statement of Dr. Naomi Lee. We immediately went to the staircase and opened the emergency door. At that point, we intended to walk. This is again at about 01:27, I believe. At that point, we intended to walk down the stairs and leave the building. We saw a lot of people walking up the stairs. I can't remember how many people were walking up. It was a lot. Enough to mean we could not go downstairs. It was people constantly walking up. There was hazy smoke in the stairwell at that point. They looked normal walking upstairs, not screaming, running or anything unusual. We didn't talk to anyone. I was a bit stunned at that point. People walking upstairs wasn't something I expected to see. At this point, a lady comes out of flat 193 and invites her and I think it's her cousin to take refuge with them in one flat 193, which of course was smoke-free at that time. They stayed there for some time, and then eventually she and her cousin came down at 03, a long time later. So from 0130 now, so this is the period before 0130, but from 0130 most lobbies are filling with dense smoke, but much less in the stair. The stair smoke was increasing, but people were still able to descend safely if they were able to reach the stair. But they had to go through the lobby first, which was very badly smoked. From 0130 to 0147, a further 31 persons entered the stair and evacuated from different floors up to the 20th, up to about 0149. And the last person to come up from that height at this point was Petra de Oliver. So her statement is quite important in this respect. Then there was a period of about 29 minutes. I'm just going to go back to my previous. Where is it? There, right. This period here, see everybody's coming down, and suddenly there's a period when nobody's leaving for about 29 minutes, straddling the 2 o'clock point. And then people come down in ones and twos at intervals over the rest of the period up to 8 o'clock before the last person came out. So a further 31 people came down at small numbers, and they were, although there was smoke in the stair, they were able to come down safely. But the smoke in the stair is increasing all the time, and there's one very useful account where somebody describes at some point coming into the stair, which was relatively smoke-free, and seeing people coming into the stair up floors above and below. And as they were opening the door from the lobby, so the smoke is coming in to the stair at all levels from the lobbies. So after this period, occupants, after this period, so we're now past 2 o'clock, and I'm sort of put a line on my graph of 2 o'clock. And I'm saying basically that up to somewhere just before around 2 o'clock, the stair itself was reasonably safe to come down. There was smoke in it, but it wasn't too bad, and people quite successfully came down during that time. After 2 o'clock, some time after 2 o'clock, when the next people start to come down, by this time the stair is really quite hazardous, and it has much denser smoke, but also high concentrations of asphyxiant gases. So from about 2 o'clock, the stair is now much more hazardous, as well as the lobbies. So Grenfell occupants descending in dense smoke after 2 o'clock, so they were able to progress rapidly by holding the handrail. For a few people, so yes, so this slide I'm addressing, once I've talked about speed of descent in the stair when it's clear. But one of the problems, going back to Professor Jin, is that if the stair gets full of smoke, we'd expect people to slow down a lot. And that was certainly the case when people were trying to find their way through the lobbies. But in the stair itself, we found in experiments that if you have a guide, like a handrail, you can still progress quite rapidly, even if you can't see hardly anything. And people reported that. And indeed, for some of these people, we can make an estimate of how long it took them to descend, where we have the end of their last 999 call, timed, and we have the time they got to the lobby. So we know the time between the two. And this tells me that, or at least for a few of these people, that we have those 2 bits of information. They were descending generally quite rapidly in the stair at this time. Now I want to go back to, so that's the situation with the stair. All right, up to 0130, both the lobbies and stair are reasonably clear and navigable. Between 0130 and 0200, very bad conditions in lobbies, but reasonable conditions in the stair. After 200, you've got hazardous conditions both in the stair and in the lobbies. I now want to go back to what's happening in the flats. And just as a sort of brief example, I'm looking at flat 16. I don't think I'll read all this, but basically, flat 16 is just an example of a simple, basic domestic fire scenario typical of the sort I described in my previous lecture. So Mr. Kabidi realised early there was a fire. I think his smoke alarm went off. He got people out. He closed the door. He warned the neighbours. Everybody evacuated and called the fire brigade. Everything was all right. But what happened next? Well, you then got this big plume of smoke coming out of his flat and flowing up the side of the tower. And here I've got some pictures from Professor Bisbee's presentation showing all this smoke. Now, this smoke is important, well, it's interesting because as smoke flows up the outside in a plume, as you can see there, it entrains air. Air mixes with it, and it becomes extremely diluted. So although it looks a bit unpleasant, if you like, it's not particularly hazardous. And some of that smoke coming from fires low in the tower is going to find its way through gaps, penetrations, open windows, whatever, into flats higher up in the stairs. So people were reporting smelling smoke. Some smoke alarms were going off. And people were being kind of warned, if you like, or becoming aware of the fire partly because of this. But at this point, it may be causing a slight haze in your flat, but nothing terribly dangerous. Apart from flowing up the outside, there may be some smoke coming in inside. And some of it may be coming from flat 16 into the lobby and then into the stair. But it all may be moving through other kinds of penetrations between floors. And I think other experts are going to be talking about those in more detail. So there are a number of routes for smoke spread. But I believe that in most of the lobbies at this early stage, the main source of smoke was coming from flat 6 on each floor, finding its way into the lobby. Okay, now we get to the point where flames ignite the exterior cladding and insulation outside flat 16. So this is at about 01:15 hours. And then as Professor Bisbee has described, it goes rapidly up the side, reaching the 23rd floor at 01:24. And the exterior fire then penetrates mostly the kitchens of flat 6 on each floor in sequence. And this spreading plume is shown in these Professor Bisbee's photographs here. So what then happened at each flat as the fire rose up the side to it, right? The first thing that's happened is that smoke is generated, that is generated immediately outside the flat. It's not thin smoke as I described. Because it's near the source, it's dense and undiluted. So it's thick, dense smoke, and it will contain significant amounts of toxic, asphyxiant gases. There are two possible main routes of dense smoke entry and flame penetration into flats as the exterior fire reaches each floor from below. One is from the exterior fire plume involving the cladding and insulation, and smoke from that and flames coming through open windows, the kitchen ventilator openings, which have been mentioned by a number of witnesses, and through sort of gaps and holes in windows, and especially where you get early partial glazing failure. And that's reported by a number of people. They say the flames came up outside and then part of my window fell out, or in one case I think they said the whole window fell out. Secondly, from an insulation fire burning in the void behind the column, as I mentioned earlier, and spandrel cladding, entering the flat through penetrations around the window frames. And you'll remember Dr. Lane describing that. This is a diagram from her report showing the routes by which this happened. And this is dense smoke with highly toxic gases. The next stage is dense smoke from combustible materials, structural materials still, not the contents of the flat, of the window surround, adding to the flame and smoke development inside the flats around the windows, especially the flat 6 kitchen and possibly the east side lounge windows. And this picture here from Dr. Lane's report shows how the fire has come in around the window and started to involve the PVC and other materials of the window around the window frame. And that's going to be a source generating more toxic gases and smoke into the enclosed flat. And then finally, the fire may spread to involve the flat contents, starting with combustible contents close to the window, such as blinds and curtains, and that was reported by a number of people, and then spreading, and this is where it gets really serious, to involve things like upholstered furniture and other items. I haven't seen that particularly described by people. So once you get to this point, you'll have the danger of having a serious fire in the room that's been penetrated. And what happens next depends a lot on what happens to the glazing and whether the windows fall out or whether they remain intact. Particularly where the windows fall out, there is a danger this fire will progress rapidly to flashover, or at least a very serious fire. And I think I've captured this on this. This is an image 3 from Professor Bisbee's presentation. And you can see here, this is taken between 156 and 223, closer to 223, according to his slide. And it's taken looking at the east face of the tower. And so at this point, the fire has already gone all the way up the flat 6 column here, and it's now moved laterally to more like the flat 1 location. So this bright flames here and here are basically the cladding and insulation burning outside those flats. But here, most of that has stopped burning, it's gone, so you can see these dark marks here. But then you've got these bright outlines of windows. So this looks to me very much like we have serious fires inside these flats involving the flat contents by this time in the fire. But I mean, this is something that the other experts are going to be very knowledgeable and interested in, and we'll be looking into in much more detail in stage 2 of the inquiry. So from first becoming aware of fire, the flat occupants were repeatedly faced with this difficult decision, stay or go. And they were affected by different considerations and experiences. But the extent of exposure to smoke or flames would be an important factor at some stage, in some cases encouraging people to get out, other stages preventing it. So if we think of what's happening in flat 6, as the early stages of development, as fire penetrates flat 6 on any floor, is likely to be still going to be similar to these domestic growing fire scenarios that I've already described to you. Except that instead of the fire starting in an armchair or appliance, it's now starting in the window surrounding the external materials. So the pattern of penetration did, well, so the flat 6 occupants were alerted by a variety of cues. In some cases, their smoke alarms went off. So the fire has just started to penetrate, and now they're aware. Most people in flat 6 became aware quite quickly there was something very bad going on, if you read their accounts. There was some variation. There's a lot of variation between different flats in fire development. And this shows up in the witness report. So some people described flames appearing at the window as their first thing that happened when they came into the kitchen to look and see what was going on. Other people woke up to find the flats full of smoke before there was any fire penetration from outside. There's a variety of different experiences, and it partly depended upon what happened to this ventilator assembly, partly on whether or not they had their windows open, it was warm weather, and various other factors. But the general pattern is of rapid smoke filling of flat 6, people being aware of it from an early stage, and realising they were in all the way up the tower, that they're in a very serious situation. And so what did they do? Well, they all evacuated, sometimes with no shoes on, partially dressed. They got out very quickly, and they were able to do so. Now, the important thing here is the flat 6 occupants left their flats before there was any significant smoke in the lobbies. And a large number of them just carried on and evacuated the tower. But others, as we heard, didn't come down the tower. They took refuge elsewhere in the tower, in other flats, sometimes on other floors. Where some flat 6 occupants stated they left their flat 6 doors open, and an open door would be a route for smoke flow into the lobbies. I'm looking to find out when and how all those lobbies became filled with dense smoke at about 01:30, which prevented other people from evacuating. And so I believe that flat 6 was probably the main source. Now, obviously, if the flat 6 door is open, it's an easy route for smoke to flow from the flat into the lobby. And so there are questions then about how those doors performed and the self-closers, whether those doors would shut after people had just come out and left them. But there are a lot of accounts of these doors remaining open and smoke flowing out and quickly filling the lobby from the ceiling down with dense smoke. Now, some people actually stated that they did in fact close their flat doors before they left. And now we would hope that that would reduce the speed of filling of the lobbies with smoke. And I'm in the process of trying to analyse these statements, but my impression is that even where the where the flat doors were shut, there was still significant leakage of smoke that filled those lobbies with quite dense smoke quite quickly. So it'll be necessary in phase 2 to look more closely into this. Of course, after they left the flats, the fire was continuing to develop in each flat. And so some of these flats were completely burned out. Now, of course, during the later parts of this fire, as we come to more towards 2 o'clock, it's these interior fires are getting very serious. And most of the smoke and toxic gases are generated in those flat fires and finding their way partly out through the windows, through the open window plume, but partly into the lobby, are coming from the flat contents burning, increasing proportion. And some of these are going to reach very high temperatures and to flash over. So when we look at the pattern, so this table 6 from my report shows the number of fatalities in each flat. And the way I've kind of organised this is that this is the sort of west side of the tower, and this is the east side of the tower. And the thing that really leaps out at you is that nobody died. There were no remains, no recovered from any flat 6. So all these people were confronted with fire coming in through the windows all the way up the tower, rapidly deteriorating conditions in their flat, but they were able to evacuate the flat. Not necessarily the tower, but they evacuated the flat into a relatively smoke-free lobby. And in many cases, they came down. The fire also spread quite rapidly to flat 1, and in general, most people left flat 1, apart from flat 201, which is a case where a lot of people were for some time. And then what also shows in this analysis is that, ironically, it's the least affected flats that then become the most dangerous. Because when people took refuge, typically in flat 3, which is in the southwest corner of the block, was the last place to be affected by fire spread around the tower. And so they remained there often for an hour or so before they were forced to evacuate or before the fire got to them. And so they were in the situation where they stayed and then got exposed. So up to 0130, most flats other than flat 6 on each floor and possibly flat 1 were generally smoke-free. From 0130 to 35, we have lobbies on various floors filling with dense irritant smoke, reports of almost zero visibility, could not see hand in front of face, difficulty breathing and irritant smoke. Some people then tried to go through this smoke, feeling their way around the walls, as I've mentioned, and this is like to have had high concentrations in the lobbies of high concentrations, but not in the stair. But fortunately, it doesn't take very long to get across the lobby. Even so, some people did report feeling dizzy while they were in the lobby around about this time. Occupants who then entered the stair between 0130 and 49 found much clearer conditions than in the lobby, not totally smoke-free, and were able to descend safely without collapsing. And I put a few examples in here, but one person in particular I want to talk about is Abram Abibi and his wife, because this is an example of a couple who came down, this is from the 7th floor, at 0148, exited at 0148 eventually. But in his statement, he recounts coming down the stair at a fairly early stage in reasonable conditions, but then finding thick black smoke in the stair between the 4th and 5th floor, and an open door to the stair with a hose going through it. So smoke is flowing out from firefighting activities from a flat into a lobby and then into the stair. And he saw this big cloud of thick black smoke in this area, and he said something along the lines of he was frightened to continue down the stair, but he was kind of preparing himself to go through because he knew he only had a couple of floors to go down. But his wife, who was a little bit higher up, called him back. So he and his wife then ascended back up to their flat until the firefighters came up and encouraged them to leave. And so they came down again. The second time they came down, the stair has now got more smoke in it, but they were kind of more confident because the firefighters had told them they could come down. So they came down, but he does say that by the time he got to the 4th floor, by now, this smoke that he'd encountered before had now cleared somewhat. So maybe at this point the firefighting operation in there had ceased and the door had been closed. Branislav Ludkik, who was one of the last people in this group to come down with his flatmate at 0149, thick smoke in the lobby, relieved to find less smoke in the stairwell. So this is 0149, 20. Could see through it more grey than black. And he was more or less carrying Clarita Gavimi, which requires a lot of physiological effort, and yet he was able to do it through the conditions at that time. So this demonstrates to me that although there was some smoke in the stair at this time, you could still descend in reasonable safety. After 0130, many occupants stayed put. Least affected flats are those in the 3 position, mostly smoke-free conditions at first, but then gradually filling. And the flat occupants then took various measures to try and limit smoke entry. And it seems at this time that most of the slow smoke filling is coming from the lobby. So again, we've got this issue of smoke penetrating partly around, possibly partly around the flat entrance doors. So at one stage, you've got smoke coming from flat 6 around the flat 6 entrance door, even if it's closed, and this was described by somebody, into the lobby. Now we've got the lobby filled with thick smoke, clear conditions in a flat, but smoke coming in the opposite direction from the lobby into the flat. So obviously there was some leakage going on. Also, some people describe smoke coming through pipe penetrations between their flat and lobby and various other routes. But anybody trying to leave now is in difficulty. So this is now a scenario where they're stuck in the flat and they have something very like the people in the closed rooms at Rose Park, slowly taking up carbon monoxide over a period of an hour or 2. And because the conditions of concentration are very low, I don't believe that cyanide would have been a significant factor in this slow build-up of CO. Now, after 2 o'clock, if occupants attempted to evacuate into the lobby, they were exposed to very high concentrations of smoke, CO, and possibly cyanide in the lobby and stair, also capable of causing collapse within minutes. The outcome for these people, I believe, depended on the dose accumulated while in the flat. So if you were in a flat that had low smoke, or you left within a short period, you would be able to descend the stair within a few minutes without collapsing. And some people certainly describe being trapped in a flat, but being able to open the exterior windows and keep some of the smoke out the flat, because it's before the fire has come around to them. So the conditions in the lobby were definitely hazardous. So the escaping occupants, some of them experienced zero visibility, breathing difficulties and pain. And as they descended, they reported being affected by the asphyxiant gases, feeling weak and dizzy, in some cases collapsing on the stair. But as the descent of people at various times shows, it was not impossible to descend the stair, as far as I could see, at any time, since some occupants succeeded in doing so at intervals from all floors up to almost 8 o'clock. I want to talk a little bit now about the blood toxicology. Now, this image on the right here is not in my phase 1 report, but these are objective data from the toxicologist that will not change. So I feel we can have a look at it now. I haven't identified any individual people here. But again, I think this is very useful because it confirms again that people were being overcome by smoke and toxic gases rather than by heat. Because as you can see, all these numbers are in the very high range, apart from this one, who was in this very low range. But that was an individual who was alive, rescued alive, and taken to hospital, and of course would have been given oxygen on the way to hospital, which would have washed out CO from his blood. Also, there was a problem with the sample. A toxicologist reported uncertainty about whether that is a true reading. Then you have 2 people who may have fallen from the tower, but they had a significant dose. So we can tell that these 2 people had been exposed to quite significant smoke, not enough to make them incapacitated, but they were exposed for some time before they fell. And then, crucially, the purple bars here are from bodies in flats. And you can see that these are all in this high range where death is occurring due to inhalation of toxic smoke. One exceptionally high in the nearly 90% carboxyhemoglobin before that person died from the smoke. And the black bars are from fatalities in the lobby or stair. And you can see they also are all well up into this death from carbon monoxide, essentially, group. So they've collapsed and died from exposure to asphyxiant gases in the smoke. If these persons found inside the flats had been overcome by heat and burns before they had time to collapse from asphyxiant gases, I would have expected to see much lower blood levels than we actually are seeing. Right, I think in view of the time, I'll stop at that point.
That's a convenient point for you, is it?
Yeah.
Right. But there's still further to go on this part of the presentation?
I think we can leave that and move on to the third one when you're ready.
Yes, right. Well, should we stop now then and take time for lunch?
Yeah.
And I'm going to say we'll resume at 2 o'clock.
Right.
That just gives you just over the hour.
Okay.
Again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence over the break. And if you go with the usher, she'll look after you.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. 2 o'clock then, please. Okay.